Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is known as the Sagan standard and entered the popular consciousness when he said it in the television program Cosmos in 1980. It is with this in mind that I want to examine David Grusch's News Nation interview from the point of view of whether or not he comes across as a credible witness. As a psychiatrist, my day job involves a lot of discerning when people are being truthful, shading the truth, outright lying, or just unreliable historians or psychotic. I think it will be useful to explore what science says about discerning truthfulness and what 3 decades of doing this professionally day in, day out have taught me. I think this is important because there is a woeful proliferation of charlatans on YouTube who peddle inaccurate information to you, their YouTube viewers. I don't claim to be an infallible human lie detector, but I will at least shoot straight and try to stick to what science and clinical experience supports. Firstly, I want to explain how I got interested in UFOs. You always need to know where the assessor is coming from and what biases they may have. Then do the analysis, then explain the scientific underpinnings of the analysis, and lastly discuss what it all means and where we might go from here. I've always been interested in science, the unknown, and the almost ungraspable vastness of space and time. As such, it seems inevitable that, as a teenager, I was gripped by the idea that, statistically speaking, it was likely there was life elsewhere. Whether that life was sentient and still in existence at this particular point in the cosmological time frame, or had eradicated itself at some great filter, was another question. The Great Filter is a concept that comes out of the world of astrobiology and attempts to resolve the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox is the apparent contradiction between the high probability estimates for the existence of extraterrestrial civilizations and the lack of contact with or evidence for such civilizations. The Great Filter proposes that at some point from the simplest forms of life to a Type 3 civilization, a civilization that can harness the energy of an entire galaxy, there is a filter that prevents or makes it extremely hard for life to progress beyond that point. This concept suggests that there's a stage in the evolutionary process that is incredibly unlikely or impossible for most life to get beyond. That stage is the Great Filter. It is also possible that there may be many slightly less great filters, with the majority of life failing to pass each filter, with the result that sentient life which is able to make contact with us may be vanishingly rare or absent in spite of an abundance of life throughout the universe. Even more intriguing was the possibility that sentient life not only coexisted with us in our universe, but visited us. This fascinated me, and so I became interested in unidentified flying objects, UFOs, and reports of aliens visiting Earth. Over the years, my interest waned as endless reports, hypotheses, and hyperbolic promises of revelation came to nothing. As I matured, I realized that the field of ufology was overrun by grifters, those with mental illnesses, and the gullible. But it also comprised stable, grounded individuals who clearly believed what they reported, and others who applied the scientific method and attempted to provide the extraordinary evidence which would prove extraordinary claims, such as Joseph Allen Hynek, Jacques Vallee, and more recently Gary Nolan. My interest in ufology was rekindled by the arrival of Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo onto the public stage in 2017. Chris Mellon is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence in both Democratic and Republican administrations, and later for Security and Information Operations. He also formerly served as the Staff Director of the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He is independently wealthy and doesn't appear to be using his position in ufology for financial gain, an important consideration. Lou Elizondo is a former U.S. Army counterintelligence special agent, employee of the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and the former director of the now-defunct Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP. He claims to have resigned from his position in order to be able to speak out about UAPs. Both Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo were instrumental in the U.S. government's 2017 release of 3 videos taken in 2004 and 2015 showing unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, the new name for UFOs, designed to destigmatize their reporting. They also helped draft the whistleblower protection portion of the National Defense Authorization Act in 2022, which is crucial to the next part of the story. I've provided a link to the full text of that act in the description. This legislation provided a mechanism for individuals with knowledge of information relating to UAPs within the US government or any government contractor who had previously been prevented from disclosing that information due to non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, or oral agreements to provide that information to Congress under amnesty. This is where David Grusch enters the timeline. On June 5th, a story reported by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, two of the reporters who broke the existence of ATIP in 2017 in the New York Times, was published by The Debrief, a news site which pitches itself as rebelliously curious in exploring frontier science and innovative technology, and has a history of covering UAP topics. This story alleged that elements within the US government had kept the truth of UAPs from the public and Congress for decades, and, in doing so, had broken faith with both the public and Congress. This was followed on June 11th by an interview between David Grusch and Ross Coulthart, an Australian journalist who has been investigating UAP for several years and wrote the book In Plain Sight, which contained many allegations about alleged UAP phenomena and the cover-up surrounding them. So, now that we've established a little of the background, let's analyze the portions of the interview featuring David Grusch.
Start off telling me your name and who you are.
My name is David Grusch. I came from a blue-collar family in Pittsburgh. I didn't have the money for college. Always admired people in uniform. And I've always wanted to be a part of something bigger than myself. 18 years ago, I got an Air Force scholarship in physics. I originally commissioned on active duty in the Air Force. Served 14 years in the Air Force. I came from a blue-collar family in Pittsburgh. I didn't have the money for college.
What's interesting here is that Grusch shakes his head negatively while making a positive statement. This is a bit unusual, but bears noting because he shakes his head negatively quite a few times later in the interview while making other positive statements.
I look at this photograph, Dave, and I see a very proud officer.
I was getting promoted to captain when I was deployed.
And you still love your country, don't you?
Absolutely.
A career intelligence officer, Grusch spent time on the ground in Afghanistan and other places he can't mention before rotating back to Washington.
I was an intel officer for the U.S. for 14 years. My last position, which I left in April of 2023, I co-led the UAP portfolio for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and some of the highest officials within the Department of Defense and Intelligence community used to call on me to advise them on some of the hardest target sets that the country had.
You are one of the most trusted former intelligence officials in the US defense and intelligence establishment.
Yes, I was.
He is quite expressive in terms of his facial expressions and head movements. He is also clearly very precise in what he says. When Ross Coulthart says he is one of the most trusted former intelligence officials, Grusch answers in the past tense that he was. You'd expect that level of precision from someone in his field, but again, it is good to confirm it in low-stakes questions at the beginning of the interview before we get into weightier matters.
You were trusted with the most intimate secrets.
Yes.
You had the security classifications to go anywhere and ask anyone anything.
I had, based on my formal security clearance and multiple polygraphs, I had the ability to be read into any program that I needed. At one point in time, I was extremely highly cleared.
Again, a very precise answer, more precise than was required by the question. He draws a distinction between having the security clearances to read anything and having the ability to be read into anything, a small but important distinction. He also clarifies that this ability only existed at a certain point in time. These sorts of clarifications are usually a sign of truthfulness, as truthful people will tend to automatically clarify issues like this to ensure there's no miscommunication or misunderstanding. Liars, on the other hand, thrive on the grey areas where things can be misunderstood and misinterpreted.
What conclusion did you come to at the end of your time on the UAP task force?
The UAP task force was refused access to a broad crash retrieval program.
The pursing of the lips and corners of the mouth going back are a sign of stress. Does that mean he's lying? No, not at all. It could just mean that he's experiencing stress during an interview, which he knows will almost certainly be seen by millions of people, including individuals searching for any breach of the restrictions on what he can say. With any such breach resulting in jail time, I'm sure you or I would be pretty stressed too.
When you say crash retrieval, what do you mean?
These are retrieving non-human origin technical vehicles, call it spacecraft if you will, non-human, exotic origin vehicles that have either landed or crashed, call it spacecraft if you will.
The negative headshake here, as Grusch says spacecraft, is a bit more troubling. It seems to denote that he doesn't believe what he's saying. There are three likely interpretations here based on what we've seen so far and what the debrief article contains. Firstly, that he's lying. Secondly, that he's just stressed and that he sometimes shakes his head while giving truthful statements, as we've already seen him do. Thirdly, and more speculatively, that he is stressed and not being entirely honest insofar as he doesn't believe spacecraft is the correct term, but non-human origin technical vehicles is. Let's look at his body language when saying non-human origin technical vehicles.
Non-human origin technical vehicles.
It is clear that the negative headshake only begins when he talks about spacecraft. I, personally, interpret this as meaning that he thinks the term non-human origin technical vehicles is correct, but the term spacecraft isn't entirely correct when referring to these vehicles.
Call it spacecraft if you will.
We have spacecraft from another species.
We do, yeah.
How many?
Quite a number.
You're kidding.
No. I thought it was totally nuts, and I thought at first I was being deceived. It was a ruse. People started confiding in me. They approached me. I have plenty of current and former senior intelligence officers that came to me, many of which I knew almost my whole career, that confided in me. They were a part of a program. They named the program. I've never heard of it. No. I thought it was totally nuts.
This seems very genuine. His face looks like he's reliving his discovery of this outwardly nuts idea. Over the rest of this clip, his head shakes negatively. I think it is still in keeping with the stress of the interview, but others could feel that it is indicative of untruthfulness.
I've never heard of it.
The eyebrow arching, facial expression, and tone of voice are all consistent with him relating something which surprised him at the time it occurred.
And they told me, based on their oral testimony, and they provided me documents and other proof, that there was, in fact, a program that the UAP task force was not read into. And other proof.
Very interesting. There's a repetition of the word other followed by a hard swallow after the word proof. These are usually signs of stress. I think it's highly significant that he wasn't asked to explain further what the other proof was. It seems reasonable to assume that the other proof consists of classified information and therefore wasn't cleared for discussion during this interview. There's little other reason that I can think of that a journalist of Coulthart's caliber wouldn't follow up with a question seeking to clarify what this other proof was. So, again, signs of high stress, but, in my opinion, not clearly signs of deception.
You are alleging that the US government has been concealing the existence on this planet of alien life.
I would couch it as non-human intelligence, NHI, like we like to say in our language.
Why do you say that? Why do you say NHI?
I don't want to necessarily denote origin. I don't think we have all the data to say, oh, they're coming from a certain location. And I couch it as somebody who studied physics where maybe they're coming from a different physical dimension as described in quantum mechanics. We know there's extra dimensions due to high energy particle collisions, et cetera. And there's a theoretical framework to explain that. Yeah.
Just let me cut to the quick, though. You're saying there is an intelligent species engaging with this planet.
Yes, that's potentially extraterrestrial. Yeah.
I speak for everybody sitting at home. That is a shock.
It was to me. And I had a lot of sleepless nights.
While these statements are extraordinary, it certainly seems that Grusch believes them to be true and is being truthful in this section.
I started out as a non-believer. I came to the problem as a hardcore physics guy, intel officer. So I have a, excuse my language, high factor, hardcore physics guy.
Again, we have the negative head shaking while saying something which is verifiably true. This and several other instances where he negatively head shakes while saying verifiably true things is why I don't think we can rely on head shaking to denote untruthfulness during this interview. I think he's just highly stressed or may just shake his head a lot while talking as a habit. We'll see if he does this in future interviews.
I was very methodical, interviewing people who didn't know each other, making sure this wasn't some kind of cover-up of some other program.
Again, his attention to detail shines through. The United States Air Force has a history of using one secret program as a cover for an even more secret program, such as when it used a secret program named Constant Peck, in which US pilots flew Soviet fighters in simulated aerial combat against US fighters over Nevada as cover for the F-117 stealth fighter program. So Grusch is saying that he excluded the possibility that this story of UAPs and non-human intelligences was a cover story hiding some other secret program. That's good due diligence.
You're not being paid for this interview?
No, I'm not.
Why are you doing this?
It's a sense of service, call me a Boy Scout or whatever. When I saw the kind of wrongdoing I did, I don't want to be 60, 70 years old in the future and have that, coulda, shoulda, woulda kind of feeling where I could have made a difference. I did not want to live a life of regret.
You are saying to the human race, for the first time, an official intelligence representative at a high level from the US government is saying publicly, we are not alone.
We're definitely not alone. Absolutely, the data points empirically that we're not alone, yeah.
Again, to me, he comes across as quite stressed, but truthful here.
You've said that the United States has spacecraft, intact craft.
We do.
This is unusual. He is pursing his lips and drawing up the corners of his mouth in an expression usually associated with distaste or disapproval. He's used this expression before in this interview. I'm just unsure what he's disapproving of. My best guess is that he might be expressing disapproval of the US having intact craft and not publicly acknowledging this. But that's just a guess.
Do we have bodies? Do we have species of
Well,
non-human?
naturally, when you recover something that's either landed or crashed, sometimes you encounter dead pilots. And believe it or not, as fantastical as that sounds, it's true. It's true.
Again with the negative head shake, this time when saying that the recovery of non-human pilot bodies is true. I can certainly see why many people have had issues with his body language throughout this interview. It does seem like the negative head shake is one of his go-to head movements when under stress. But the fact that he has used it multiple times when saying verifiably truthful things during this interview means that it cannot be taken as a clear indicator of lying for Grusch.
Believe it or not, as fantastical as that sounds,
Well, he certainly recognizes that his claims sound fantastical, emphatically so.
Have you seen spacecraft?
I've seen some interesting photos and I've read some very interesting reports.
Let's deal with the issue of your credibility.
Mm-hmm.
Why should we believe you? You're just somebody coming out of nowhere, making claims that we really ultimately can't prove.
Yeah. Well, we provided the proof internally to the Inspector General and the Hill staff. We went into all the details. I mean, I have the credentials. I was an intelligence officer on the UAP task force.
But let's face it, allegations of aliens and their spacecraft are hard to accept.
Went into all the details.
Again with the negative head shake. Obviously, the Inspector General is going to have done a thorough job investigating his complaint, so it doesn't make sense to think that he is being untruthful about this. Again, I think it is indicative of stress and the remembrance of stressful times.
It is a well established fact, at least mathematically and based on empirical observation and analysis, that there most likely are physical additional spatial dimensions. You could imagine in 4 and 5D space where what we experience as linear time ends up being a physical dimension in higher dimensional space, where if you were living there, you could translate across what we perceive as a linear flow. So there is a possibility that, and this is a theory here, I'm not saying this is 100% the case, but it could be that this is not necessarily extraterrestrial, and it's actually coming from a higher dimensional physical space that might be co-located, right here.
What can you tell me about these craft, these technologies? Why do you know it's exotic?
Based on the very specific properties that I was briefed on, isotopic ratios that would have to be engineered for it to be at those levels, but also just extremely strange, heavy atomic metal, high up in the periodic table arrangements that we don't understand, what the emergent properties are, but there's just a very strange mix of elements.
So you're absolutely sure that the materials that these craft are made of are clearly not of this earth?
Yeah, they're sophisticatedly engineered, certainly not by humans.
He looks to me like he's reliving his confusion about the structure of these vehicles as he talks about them. This is, again, indicative of this being a true recollection and statement.
If you're right, if you're telling us the truth, everyone, the entire American public, has been lied to for decades.
Yeah, there's a sophisticated disinformation campaign targeting the U.S. populace, which is extremely unethical and immoral. 1933 was the first recovery in Europe, in Magenta, Italy. They recovered a partially intact vehicle. Yeah, that actually happened. Italian government moved it to a secure air base in Italy for the rest of kind of the fascist regime until 1944, 1945. And, the Pope Pius XII back-channeled that.
So the Vatican was involved.
Yeah, and told the Americans what the Italians had, and we ended up scooping it.
So let me be very clear about this. You're saying that the Catholic Church, the Vatican, they know about the existence of non-human intelligence on this planet?
Certainly.
These are remarkable claims, and they'll need verification from other sources before we can accept them fully. But there isn't anything in how Grusch is saying them to make me believe he is being untruthful.
What can you tell me about the Roswell craft?
Fortunately, those details were not approved for me to talk about right now. Fortunately, those details were not approved for me to talk about right now.
This is a little bizarre, and I'm very surprised it made it into the interview. It appears that Grusch made a Freudian slip and said fortunately instead of unfortunately. In the wider context of the interview, him saying that fortunately something was not approved for him to talk about right now makes very little sense. But Freudian slips come from somewhere, and so it makes me wonder if secretly he isn't happy that he cannot go into further detail at this time. I wonder if he's concerned about exposing too much information at once and causing ontological shock. Ontological shock refers to profound, disorienting disruption in one's understanding of the nature of reality, otherwise known as ontology. Of course, the other interpretation is that he doesn't have this evidence or proof, and that he is slipping up Freudianly because he's quite happy that he's not going to be exposed by having to give this evidence or proof.
It just read ridiculous to me that the US Air Force had changed its story.
Yeah, and they added additional elements over time and tried to conflate additional programs to explain some of the events.
For those interested in reading more about this, I've included a link to the full 1994 Roswell report, so you can read it and draw your own conclusions.
Why are these things crashing?
Yeah, some are landed, some are crashed, and I think that's an interesting discussion that's come up, as advanced as, we are, as humans, right? Planes crash, cars crash. Just because you're some advanced sentience that has advanced technology doesn't mean some small percentage of your, I'll use the Air Force term like sorties, meet an unfortunate operational conclusion, as we might want to say.
The small mix of humor there about the turn of phrase, unfortunate operational conclusion, just has the ring of truth to it. It seems like the sort of phrase those in an organization would wryly use to describe crashes. It's the counterpart of the completely successful operation followed by a transfer to the 13th floor. In other words, the patient died in medicine. It is the sort of spontaneous embellishment you see in truthful stories, which tend to be omitted from untruthful tales.
That analysis I did was a total hack job. And even anybody with analytical skills, if you read it, you can deduce that they're conflating multiple situations with crash test dummies and mogul balloons. And they're just saying that the townsfolk who personally witnessed it were totally imagining things. They concocted that whole report just to disinform.
So the reason for the secrecy exactly is what?
Feudalistic dominance, who can have both asymmetric technology for, it seems like, just fueling the war machine.
Feudalistic dominance and the war machine. This is clearly a man who is disillusioned with the military-industrial complex. I think that this language use casts light on his motivations. Combined with the reference to possibly being a Boy Scout earlier in the interview, it makes me think that Grusch sees himself as a good guy fighting against an archaic and much more powerful system aiming to maintain the status quo.
They saw a craft, appearing to be intelligently controlled, hovered over a nuclear weapons silo and shut down 10 nuclear ICBM missiles.
Mm-hmm. It certainly looks like they want to understand how far we've advanced in our nuclear fizzle kind of technologies at the very least. I mean, it looks like preparatory probing activity. It might be innocent kind of scientific gathering, could be ISR probing.
Preparatory probes and ISR are both military terms. ISR stands for Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance. These are key activities that help the military make informed decisions about operations and strategies. Intelligence involves gathering and analysing information about enemy forces, terrain, weather, and other factors. Surveillance is the continuous monitoring of areas of interest. Reconnaissance involves conducting exploratory surveys or examinations to gain information about an enemy or an area. The goal of ISR operations is to provide commanders with the most current and accurate picture of the battlefield possible, enabling them to make the best decisions for their forces. The third option mooted is innocent intelligence gathering. So, two military terms and one peaceful term, with the peaceful term being linked to innocence. Immediately, this makes me think that the other two terms are linked to potential malevolence in Grusch's mind. So far, so ominous, especially given that Grusch has been quite particular with his choice of words most of the time previously.
A lot of them, were injured. Looking at some of this stuff, you could imagine the nuclear, radiological, and biological risk to looking at an unknown, and a lot of them have literally suffered physically because of their service.
If you're right, if you're telling us the truth, everyone, the entire American public, has been lied to for decades.
Yeah, there's a sophisticated disinformation campaign targeting the U.S. populace, which is extremely unethical and immoral.
There's an industry of debunkers out there on the web who say, oh, they've got this all wrong. It's a jet exhaust at a distance and the aircraft's turning. Give me an answer on that.
Well, I had some optical engineering experts look at that and the Raytheon AT FLIR system based on the pixel saturation and apparent size. It's certainly something that's not a jet. It might be some kind of natural phenomenon that's quite strange, but it's not as simple as a jet.
And the Tic Tac?
Truly anomalous, absolutely technical vehicle, physical, and that's absolutely something that we did make.
Not of this world.
Most likely, yeah.
This video, shot on the USS Omaha and later leaked to documentarian Jeremy Corbell, has received particular attention.
It zooms off so fast you can't see it, or it sinks into the ocean, but it seems to drop. What do you know about it?
It was truly anomalous.
But Grusch says the promised new age of government transparency is a fallacy.
There are many videos that are totally fair to release through a declassification process. And I find it very concerning from a transparency perspective that all that the department is declassified, or those 3 famous videos. There are more concerning videos that left me with a lot of questions. Yeah. A lot of them were very large, yeah. Like a football field kind of size. And I remember interviewing these personnel. I'm like, either these people are lying to me, or having a psychotic break, or this is some crazy but true stuff that's happening. And I have no good explanation that's prosaic at all for this, because this is not explainable by, swamp gas, St. Elmo's fire, ball lightning, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is like tangible technical craft they're seeing up close and personal in some cases when I interview people.
Again, extraordinary claims, but Grusch's facial expressions and body language are those of a man remembering events he believes to be true. There is an effortless emotional expression when relating these claims, which is generally indicative of truthfulness.
And at the centre of it all, the crash retrieval program that's included at least one private aerospace company that is storing alien craft. Is that true?
That is how a lot of these relationships are. While I don't want to name the specific companies and government elements, but overall, the government has been the custodian of a lot of this, right? And they'll hand receipt it out to a cleared defense contractor to do some analysis, which I find highly unethical. You have basically a sole source arrangement, and you allow certain private corporate elements to look at this, develop a potential insight, and then sell it back to the government for profit. And I think that's totally unethical.
Again, he emphasizes the unethicality of what he believes is happening. I think that we're seeing his motivation here, a disgust at his perception of the unethicality and immorality of certain elements of the military-industrial complex. I think it is very interesting that he doesn't mention illegality at the same time, but I'm not sure what to make of that. If I were pushed, I'd guess that there are many things which are legal, which aren't moral or ethical, and that Grusch views morality and ethicality as being on a higher plane than simple legality, and therefore his main driver is the immorality and unethicality rather than any illegality. This is not to say that exposing illegality doesn't motivate him, just that it isn't one of his primary motivators.
The problem you've got is there have been categorical denials from high-level officials in the US government, even presidents, that what you're saying is true.
Unfortunately, some elected officials were not brought in.
While a large number of cases in our holdings remain technically unresolved, this is primarily due to a lack of data associated with those cases.
Was that a lie?
Well, I know Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. I've known him for about 8 years. And, I expressed some concerns to Dr. Kirkpatrick about a year ago and told him what I was starting to uncover. And he didn't follow up with me. And he has my phone number. He could have called me. I hope he ultimately does the right thing. He should be able to make the same investigative discoveries I did. It's totally crazy if he doesn't.
Well, he is not a fan of Sean Kirkpatrick. There's lip-pursing, facial grimacing when talking about him, and the statement that it would be crazy if Kirkpatrick doesn't uncover the same things Grusch did. Crazy is a strong word, but particularly so for someone like Grusch, who clearly is used to choosing his words with care.
So the implication here is that the head of the very body that Congress has ordered to tell the American public the truth about UAPs is possibly misleading the American public. Do you think the American public is being lied to?
Well, they've been lied to over the years, and I'm hoping that the lies stop.
Again with the negative head shaking. I can see why some would interpret this as being indicative of him not actually meaning it when he says that he hopes the lies stop. Again though, I'd point to the times that he shook his head when saying verifiably true things. I think that this is just a weird behaviour of Grusch, or a sign of the significant stress he was no doubt under when recording this interview.
We're in a competition with their adversaries to understand this. And it's a multi-decade Cold War that has been under our nose for so long.
The common interpretation from some commentators is that there is a non-human species and it's incredibly benevolently well disposed to the human race.
Yeah, and I think that is the logical fallacy there is because they're advanced, they're kind. We'll never really understand full intent in that because we're not them, whatever them is or are. But I think what appears to be malevolent activity has happened based on not only nuclear site probing activities, witness testimony. I think at least if we look at it through a humanistic lens, it does appear negative, at least to us.
That's the face of a man telling you something he doesn't like, with lips semi-pursed and a quasi-grimace on his face.
I've been told that there have been attempts to bring down craft, that we've acted offensively against non-human craft.
There have been instances, and there are certain techniques.
Have human beings been hurt or killed by a non-human intelligence?
While I can't get into the specifics because that would reveal certain U.S. classified operations, I was briefed by a few individuals on the program that there were malevolent events like that.
No, I'm scared. People have just heard you say non-humans may well have murdered human beings.
That seems to be the case at one point.
Again, Grusch's penchant for specificity rears its head.
At one point.
It is a pity it wasn't clarified during the interview if this one point was one incident or one period of time or a misspeaking, and there have been many incidents of malevolence.
We're in a competition with their adversaries to understand this. And it's a multi-decade Cold War that has been under our nose for so long. And, there is no good way to level the playing field and hold other nation states accountable if they're doing unethical or illicit activity as it relates to this subject. And I think the obtuse secrecy is actually putting us in a very dangerous position where a country might make a breakthrough. Let's say that's an adversary of ours. And it is so destabilizing.
You say there's been a Cold War behind the scenes with Russia and China.
There has been a Cold War with our peer adversaries, yeah.
Why hasn't Russia or China come out and spoken publicly about this?
I think they're in a similar, pickle as us, where it's they understand maybe some of the socioeconomic destabilization factors in their own society.
Grusch has written an internal document about his discoveries that refers to agreements that risk putting our future in jeopardy.
And it's quite clear that you're talking about agreements between America and non-human intelligences. Have we made agreements with non-human intelligences?
That's the kind of information I really hope national leadership is able to get to the bottom of.
I need to pin you down on this. Are there agreements between non-human intelligences and the American government?
I think that's a question that I would like to know all the details of as well.
Well, we went from ominous to downright scary. What Grusch seems to be saying is that the US national leadership may not be aware of agreements that elements of the US military-industrial complex have made with non-human intelligences, and that those agreements may endanger our future. That's potential nightmare fuel. There have been rumors or conspiracy theories about such treaties in ufology circles over the years. Most famous is the supposed Griada treatment, which is an alleged agreement between the US government and extraterrestrials in 1954, where President Eisenhower is alleged to have met with aliens and agreed to a secret pact. The terms of the supposed treaty are typically said to involve an exchange. The aliens would provide advanced technology, and, in return, they would be allowed to abduct a limited number of humans for study, provided that those studies were unharmed and had their memories of the event erased. No substantive evidence of such a treaty has ever been made public, to my knowledge.
We do know of at least one agreement among humans that's worth noting. This 1971 agreement between the US and the USSR on measures to reduce the risk of nuclear war. Whether or not you believe Dave Grusch, this document proves the two superpowers were aware that UAP existed, whatever they were.
If you look at Article 3 of that treaty, it talks about unidentified objects near nuclear facilities or interfering with communications. And that is a treaty that has been used, from what I understand, to notify each other if there's a concerning event.
And that's a way of saying to the Russians, hey, don't shoot at us. It's not us.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a concern because of the secrecy. There is an environment where you could have almost like a false flag, where true non-prosaic UAP situation could be contrived as, a provocation of something from a nation state. We want to de-escalate that.
Can I put it to you that crimes must have been committed?
At the very least, I saw substantive evidence that white-collar crime was committed.
Have people been killed to protect this secret?
Based on the people I talked to, that was an ongoing concern. Yeah, unfortunately, I've heard some really un-American things I don't want to repeat right now.
So you have a strong suspicion that people have been murdered to protect the secret?
Over the years, yeah.
This again fits in with UFO lore, and it makes sense that if an element within the US government were keeping such a monumental secret, they'd be willing to kill to keep it. Governments have killed for far less. It is still a staggering accusation, and one which greatly complicates the task of bringing any such program to light, since those involved may know that bringing it to light would involve bringing multiple grave felonies to light also.
Everybody watching this right now is looking at your face.
Mm-hmm.
They're going, it's this guy for real.
He's just a guy talking on camera, and a lot of his answers to our most pointed questions sound like this.
Can you comment?
Unfortunately, I cannot.
So who is this guy really?
I don't want fame or fortune. I'm just here to provide public leadership on an issue that I uncovered, and I thought it was totally outrageous.
Public leadership. That makes my spidey sense tingle. With anything to do with UAPs, we always need to keep an eye out for the deluded or the grifter, and taking up the mantle of public leadership always raises concerns about the possibility of grift. Let's see what exactly he means by this.
Maybe he's just a confident, well-spoken, ex-military intelligence officer who just happens to have lost his mind.
Do you have any kind of mental illness?
No.
Have you ever had a psychosis, a delusion?
No.
Is there anything in your medical history that might be capable of being interpreted as a reason why you might be confabulating, making things up?
No, I'm not a disgruntled employee. I resigned on my own accord because I thought altruistically it's more appropriate to show thought leadership on the outside on this now. Because I, hit an impasse within the government to try to right this wrong.
It would be an intrusion into Grusch's privacy, but it would be very helpful if he could release his medical records publicly, or at least some portion of them, or at least show them to an independent reviewer so that this could be independently verified.
So I've got to be blunt about this.
Yeah.
You're not making this up. This is not a lie.
No, absolutely not.
Because everybody watching this right now is looking at your face.
Mm-hmm.
They're going, it's this guy for real.
I am for real. And I'm sitting here at great personal risk and obvious professional risk by talking to you today.
You've told us that we really are not alone. Even though you believe what you say is true, you haven't been fed disinformation. It's a common thing in intelligence for governments to mislead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was very sensitive to that fact. Was this some kind of ruse against me? Am I being used in any kind of way? And I took about 4 years being very methodical before I filed my whistleblower complaint to be absolutely certain of these basic facts. Was this some kind of ruse against me? Am I being used in any kind of way?
He seems to be believable to me here. The content of what he is saying is exactly what I'd expect someone in his position, presented with such information, to think and outrule.
But take me through the process of how you convinced yourself that this is real.
Well, based on the credential people that came to me, some of these subjects provided me sensitive foreign intelligence to read, sensitive program documents and photographs to evaluate, and then described in very specific detail how all this worked. And they were telling me the exact, extremely specific details that it all checked out. Yeah.
You know, the thing I have trouble with, it's the fact that my experience as a journalist is it's very hard for governments to keep secrets. Most things leak.
Mm-hmm.
Your government leaks like a sieve.
Mm-hmm.
Why hasn't this leaked?
Well, I've certainly been the recipient of a lot of U.S. government secrets, and I can tell you they've never seen the light of day. That's for sure. And I guess ostensibly this has leaked like a sieve for decades, but it was a very sophisticated disinformation campaign where, they have allowed some of the truth to come out through some of their trade crafts, but they've disenfranchised people. They've stigmatized it. They made it like this total like wacky thing to talk about. So anybody who may come forward with that kind of information is looked like a, total tinfoil hat guy, because it's a perfect amalgamation of disinformation to just make it look crazy.
Again, he comes across as believing what he says here, and what he says makes objective sense. If it is real, the program has had leaks, but those leaks and leakers appear to have been very successfully discredited. Even in considering whether or not to analyze this video, I had to consider whether or not posting an analysis of a UAP-related interview would damage my professional credibility. I decided that given the potential importance of this interview, if the accusations in it are confirmed in the future, that it was worth covering. But the very fact that I thought about not covering it for fear of stigma shows the level of stigma attached to the whole area.
The best reason to believe Dave Grusch may be this document.
So the Inspector General of the Intelligence Services of the United States has the information you've got.
Yes.
And more importantly, the Inspector General made a determination about the credibility of your complaint.
They found, after interviewing myself and the subjects and other subjects that I'm not even cognizant on who they were, they found my complaint urgent and credible for the intelligence committees.
The word credible is important.
Yes.
You appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
So an official investigatory body of the United States government has determined that your allegations are credible.
Credible just means they might be true, not that they are true.
This is one of the gravest constitutional crises for your country ever.
Absolutely.
Give me some hope here.
Yeah.
There are good people.
There are very good people, and I want that message to be crystal clear. Let's not demonize holistically the U.S. government. There's a whole army of people that want change. I am one of tens, if not hundreds, of individuals within the government on these programs that would like a change. There are very good people, and I want that message to be crystal clear.
Two observations. He is using a precision-denoting movement of his left hand when he says he wants the message that there are good people in the US government to be clear. This seems truthful and sincere to me. And he appears to be left-hand dominant, since that's the hand he subconsciously tends to use when emphasizing or clarifying certain points.
I use nuclear weapons or nuclear physics as an example. It's an acknowledged program. We have nuclear weapons, so you don't get to know the designs, but nuclear physics holistically is unclassified. Academia studies it. And why would you suppress basic astrophysics, astrobiology, other hard and soft sciences broadly? It's totally nuts.
His paraverbal channel here, tone of voice, intonation, pace of speech, etc., is quite convincing to me. It is my opinion that he believes what he is saying.
I make myself available to Secretary Austin, DNI Haynes, who was a recipient of my complaints. I'm happy to further brief elected officials on the specific ecosystem of secrecy down to the fine details.
Whoever they are. How will the non-human intelligence react to the revelation that human beings now know they're here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the non-human intelligences have been around for a while, at least multiple decades in modern history, and they've allowed ourselves to annihilate ourselves, genocide, war, famine, etc. So at the very least, I think they're kind of neutral on what humans decide to do with their free will.
Very interestingly, despite the question being posed referring to a single non-human intelligence, his answer refers to the plural, non-human intelligences. He also says something very interesting when he references how long they have been here. He says they've been here for multiple decades in modern history. I wonder why he felt the need to add the qualifier, in modern history. Given how precise he is striving to be with his language, it seems to me that he is leaving open the possibility that the non-human intelligences have been here in non-modern history prior to 1933. Again, there isn't a follow-up question to this, which is a pity.
I don't have this utopian ideology that this is going to, solve world problems, stop war entirely. But all I want is a moment of pause and to see if the subject unites us, as we've obviously become more divided over the last couple decades.
Because, if anything else, what you're revealing may mean we all start thinking of ourselves not as American, Australian, Russian, Chinese, but as human.
Human family, I think that's totally the right term, yeah.
I'm struck again by the specificity of his word usage in this answer. Ross Coulthart opines that we may start thinking of ourselves as humans instead of nationals of one country or another. And Grusch interjects, human family. I think that's totally the right term. Why specify human family instead of human? It could be meaningless, but I wonder if it could refer to the taxonomic status of Homo sapien. Taxonomy is the science of classification. In biology, it is the method used to categorize and name organisms. This system is important because it allows scientists to identify, study, and discuss specific organisms, ensuring there's a consistent way to name organisms and a structure that shows how organisms are related to each other. Modern humans are classified as belonging to the family of Hominidae, a family characterized by a suite of traits relating to our bipedalism, reduced body hair, increased brain size, and the abilities for tool use and complex social interaction. There's too little information yet to know if this is a meaningless clarification, because Grusch is quite a pedantic man, or whether it is a very meaningful clarification indeed. Doubtless there will be future interviews and we will be able to see if this specific clarification is made again. If it is, then it is likely intentional. If it isn't, then it might just be a meaningless pedantism on Grusch's part. Now, let's look at Mick West, Ross Coulthart, and Michael Schellenberger discussing the content of this interview in the discussion segment which followed its airing.
Are you essentially calling David Grusch a liar?
No, I think he seems to actually believe what he's saying. But the clip you just played there, that the complaint and the IG adding credibility to his story, isn't actually true. His lawyer, who just basically parted ways with him a couple of days ago, issued a statement, which is quite unusual, saying that they had been misrepresented and that the whistleblower complaint was actually very narrowly scoped and did not speak to the specifics of the alleged classified information that Mr. Grusch is now publicly characterizing. So the idea that it adds credibility to the actual claims he is making isn't true. It's simply credible that he's making some allegation that there was something that was covered up, not what that thing actually was.
I think that it is important for everyone involved to take an approach based on verifiable facts. Skeptics are often accused of disbelieving everything, while ufologists are accused of believing anything. More details about the specifics of the Inspector General complaint are coming out, and will provide clarity about exactly what the scope was, what the findings were, and what evidence that disproves or provides for Grusch's claims.
Let me bring Ross in because there is some, there's an interesting development. I read the statement too, Ross. I didn't quite read it like that. I took the statement from his lawyer and the former Inspector General to be, look, we did what we were out to do here to get him this far. and we've finished. I mean, what's going on with the lawyer?
Okay, let me just make it very clear here. Mix, unfortunately, misconceived what the lawyers were actually talking about. Great respect. The simple fact is the representations that were made by the Inspector General, not by the lawyers, are the ones that are relevant. And the Inspector General of Intelligence Security, and I've confirmed this with Mr. Grusch, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security took evidence under oath, not only from Mr. Grusch, but also from people inside the legacy UAP program. Witnesses have given evidence in support of David Grusch's allegations to the Inspector General. And it wasn't just about the reprisal allegations. Unfortunately, you're going to hear in coming days, I can't talk about it at this stage, but you're going to hear in coming days that Chuck McCullough is still acting for David Grusch. He hasn't dissociated himself from his client at all. And in fact, you will see something I'm not allowed to explain, but basically it'll come out in due course that Mr. McCullough is still acting for his client.
What would his reason for lying be?
I don't necessarily think that he's lying. All the stuff that he says has been cleared by DOPSA, the Defense Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review. That doesn't mean that it's actually true. It doesn't mean that he's lying, but it also doesn't mean that it's accurate. The things that have been cleared for release are
I don't
quite
get it. I'm sorry. I don't understand.
Yeah.
What do you mean if you don't believe his story, but then wouldn't he be lying? Explain to me what you mean.
No, he will be mistaken. If someone has told him stuff and he believes that what they have told him, he is not lying. He's just mistaken. And the claims that he's made are quite extraordinary, and they're things that would be secret. The idea that we have aliens are killing Americans, the thing that we've discovered these craft, and the actual details of the analysis that we've performed on this isotopic analysis and things like that. If that was actually an adversary craft, we wouldn't want them to know what type of analysis we performed on them. So he's revealing things that would be secret. They've been cleared by the Department of Defense, which means they're not actually secret, which probably means that they're not actually true.
This contention is one that should be tested. If Grusch is telling the truth, then turning an investigative lens on his story should uncover proof of its veracity. I am already gathering information for a follow-on video examining the various supporting statements, additional claims, and debunkings of Grusch, which have begun appearing since this interview. Let's sort the wheat from the chaff and try to, as impartially as possible, see what proof there is to support these extraordinary claims.
Interesting. Okay, I follow what you're saying now. Michael, I want to bring you in. You've said publicly just this week that you have heard from sources who also back up what Grusch has said. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's right. And I just want to clarify that I have not said that I believe David Grusch. What I've said is that I've spoken to multiple other people with high levels of security clearance who confirm the basic claim that Grusch is making, which is that the U.S. government is in possession of over 12 non-human craft. I'm actually not making statements about my own beliefs. I'm reporting what I was told by people with a lot of credibility that are in a position to know and that are very sane and so respected that they have achieved high levels of security clearance.
So, where does this leave us? We've seen an interview in which many extraordinary claims were made, but what methodology do I use to assess these statements as a professional? Well, there's a lot of research about what works and doesn't. Let's look at how to spot liars. Mountains of research has shown that body language on its own is often no better than chance at detecting lying, and that many of the bodily behaviors which body language proponents claim indicate lying can actually indicate a variety of emotions and actions, and must be interpreted in context. Body language is usually good at showing if someone is stressed or happy, etc., but is very bad at determining why they might be stressed or happy. The largest research paper into the accuracy of spotting deception, Bond and DePaulo's 2006 paper, featuring almost 25,000 observers, found that people spotted 47% of lies and 61% of truths correctly. This made for an average of 54% accuracy, barely more than chance. They also showed that the lowest accuracy of 52% came when the observers relied only on body language. The highest accuracy of 63% was when they could only hear the person, and when they could both see and hear the person, the accuracy was 56%. This is supported by Hodge's meta-analysis from 2016, which showed that training people in identifying non-verbal cues of deception only improved their accuracy very slightly, while training them in analyzing the content of the person's speech yielded moderate improvements in accuracy. Links to the full text of both articles are contained in the description of the video. If you'd like to learn more about the science or lack thereof behind discrete body language detection of lying, let me know in the comments and I could make a video on it. Now, obviously, if you want to take a whole number of bodily behaviors together and look at them in context, they may be able to broadly communicate a thing. For example, someone tapping their foot on the ground, tapping their hands on their knees, looking exasperated, tutting, and checking their watch while standing at a bus stop is likely to be annoyed at being delayed or waiting for a bus. But any one of those bodily behaviors in isolation could easily indicate something else. Also, many bodily behaviors can denote a certain emotion, but interpreting why that person is feeling that emotion is also important. Dr. G Explains actually had a good video about David Grusch's body language, in which he does a good job of showing which body language is indicative of stress, without jumping to unwarranted conclusions about truthfulness, just on the basis of body language. I've included a link to this video in the description. Various interviewing styles, such as strategic use of evidence, verifiable interviewing, and cognitive credibility, have also been shown to help spot lies. I'll go into a little detail on each of these three interviewing styles, as they will be key to the analysis of David Grusch's News Nation interview with Ross Coulthart today and, I suspect, into the future. Detecting deception can be challenging and often requires a strategic approach. One method involves the strategic use of evidence, where the interviewer holds back some evidence and then observes the subject's responses when the evidence is later revealed. In the context of detecting liars, the strategic use of evidence can involve the following steps. Gathering evidence. The first step involves collecting as much evidence as possible related to the matter under investigation. This evidence can include physical evidence, witness testimonies, surveillance footage, or documentary evidence. Initial interview. During the initial interview, the interviewer does not immediately present all of the evidence. Instead, they ask open-ended questions to let the person tell their story freely. This gives the person an opportunity to provide a statement or explanation which represents their own narrative. Observing inconsistencies. The interviewer pays close attention to the person's account, looking for any inconsistencies or contradictions with the known evidence. They will also watch for nonverbal cues of deception, although, as previously noted, these can often be unreliable. Presenting the evidence. Once the person has given their initial account, the interviewer can begin to introduce the evidence. This should be done strategically. Instead of presenting all the evidence at once, it can be more effective to present one piece of evidence at a time, allowing the person to respond to each piece. Evaluating responses. When confronted with the evidence, deceptive people usually change their story, become defensive, or exhibit stress. The interviewer observes these responses carefully. A truthful person, on the other hand, is usually surprised or confused by false evidence, and remains consistent in their denials. Follow-up interviews. In some cases, it may be necessary to conduct follow-up interviews. This can be especially useful if new evidence emerges or if the person's story changes over time. It's important to note that the strategic use of evidence is a tool to assist in the evaluation of a subject's truthfulness and must be used in conjunction with other investigative techniques. It should also be noted that it is difficult to rely on this technique when we don't actually conclusively know the truth before interviewing someone. In Grusch's case, as he is a whistleblower and his claims are extraordinary, we don't already have evidence of his claims, and so the strategic use of evidence is of little use with him, except insofar as we can check peripheral facts which often trip up liars. Verifiable interviewing is a technique based on the premise that truth tellers can provide more verifiable details in their statements compared to liars. Here's a brief overview of how verifiable interviewing works. Asking for verifiable details. In a verifiable interview, the interviewer asks the subject to provide details about the event that are potentially verifiable. These details can include information about who was present, the timing of the event, the location, and specific actions. They could also involve peripheral details like the weather, what people were wearing, or any unusual or distinctive events that occurred. Verification process. After the interview, the investigator can attempt to verify the details provided by the interviewee. This can involve checking surveillance footage, talking to witnesses, or looking up records or documents. The aim is to determine if the details provided by the subject are accurate and consistent with other available information. Comparing verifiable details. Truth tellers should be able to provide more details that can be verified compared to liars. This is because liars may be hesitant to provide details that could be checked and potentially expose their deception. They may also have difficulty inventing believable details on the spot. This is why it can be useful to ask about irrelevant details, as it is unlikely any story will have been rehearsed to such a level of detail, and by forcing the person to make up details on the spot, it is far more likely that inconsistencies will be uncovered and stress engendered. Analyzing inconsistencies. If the subject account contains numerous details that can't be verified, or that are directly contradicted by other evidence, this could suggest deception. However, some inaccuracies may be due to honest mistakes or faulty memory, so it's essential to consider the context and other evidence. It's important to note that while verifiable interviewing can be a useful tool in deception detection, it's not infallible. Not all truthful accounts will contain many verifiable details, and some liars may be skilled at inventing details that can't be easily checked, particularly if they are practiced or pathological liars. As such, it should be used as part of a broader investigative strategy rather than as a standalone method for detecting deception. In Grusch's case, the fact that he is a whistleblower prevents us verifying much of the information he provides. This is the nature of cover-ups. However, we can verify his service record, the positions he held, and through him gain access to others who can vouch for otherwise unverifiable parts of his story. I should also note that many of Grusch's statements which are unverifiable publicly should be eminently verifiable when he briefs those, like Congress, who have the security clearances to investigate and be provided with evidence which he and others are not allowed to divulge to the public. Cognitive credibility interviewing is a method used to evaluate the truthfulness of an individual statement based on its cognitive characteristics. The technique operates on the premise that there are distinct cognitive differences between truthful and fabricated accounts. This method relies on the idea that truthful memory-based accounts have different properties than invented stories. When people recall actual events, the memory retrieval process involves a complex network of interconnected memories, which is generally rich in detail, has a clear sensorial and spatial temporal context, and often includes emotional reactions. In contrast, fabricated stories often lack the same level of detail or sensory and emotional information because they are not based on a remembered event. They are often more simplistic, and liars may need to expend more cognitive effort to keep their story consistent, leading to signs of cognitive strain or less fluency in their account. Here's how cognitive credibility interviewing may work. Information gathering. The interviewer asks the person to give a free narrative of the event, encouraging them to provide as many details as possible. Open-ended questions are used to allow the person to speak freely. Assessment of cognitive characteristics. The interviewer then assesses the narrative based on several cognitive characteristics. Truthful statements are typically expected to have the following properties. They are generally richer in detail. They often include more contextual information about the environment, spatial and temporal information, and sensory details. They usually present interactions, conversations, and unexpected complications. They typically contain more emotional, cognitive, and perceptual statements. Subsequent questioning. After the initial account, the interviewer may ask follow-up questions, focusing on the person's ability to provide additional, consistent details and their reactions to unexpected questions or shifts in the conversation. Remember, though, while these cognitive differences can be helpful in assessing the credibility of an account, they are not foolproof. Other factors can influence a person's narrative, including stress, individual differences in memory and communication abilities, and the nature of the event itself. Thus, cognitive credibility interviewing should be just one part of a larger process of evidence gathering and assessment. If you're interested in reading more about how professionals use these methods to spot lies and liars, let me know in the comments and I'll make a video going into further detail. So, is David Grusch delusional, misled, a liar, or one of the greatest whistleblowers in history? Grusch doesn't overtly present as someone suffering from schizophrenia, mania, depression, a delusional disorder, or any other relevant psychiatric illness. Were I to see him as a new patient, I'd find his allegations absolutely mind-blowing, but I wouldn't diagnose him with anything or recommend treatment until I were better able to verify the veracity of his allegations. And do bear in mind that this is not the first time I've heard people talk to me about aliens and present fantastical stories as part of my working life. At many times throughout the interview, he uses body language which is congruent with what he is saying, nodding his head when making verifiable statements, using hand movements to emphasize points or signify precision, but sometimes he shakes his head when making statements he purports to be true. Given that he shakes his head early on in the interview and making verifiably truthful statements, it seems that the head shaking isn't always indicative of lying in Grusch's case, but may just be due to stress in what, for him, must have been an incredibly stressful interview. We can't use the strategic use of evidence to test for truthfulness for most of this interview since, for so many of his claims, we don't have publicly available evidence at this point with which to strategically test the narrative he presents. The same problem applies to the technique of verifiable interviewing. At this point in time, the public just doesn't have sufficient insight into these alleged programs to verify what he says. This is where the US Congress and the US Senate come in. Given the security clearances and oversight authority they have, they could apply the technique of verifiable interviewing to Grusch's statements and, hopefully, verify or disprove enough of his statements to determine his truthfulness and, by extension, uncover what's actually going on as regards UAPs. That leaves us with the technique of cognitive credibility, where his recollections throughout the interview fluent, rich in detail, and complete with emotional reactions and a clear sensorial and spatial temporal context. In my opinion, they were. There were several times when Grusch clearly exhibited emotional reactions to what he was remembering and saying. Additionally, there were a couple of occasions when that fluidity abandoned him. He tripped over his words when talking about other proofs early on in the interview and gave very mixed signals when using the word spacecraft. My sense is that while he is willing to use the word spacecraft in this initial interview, he doesn't believe it is the correct word to use. Why that is, I don't know. The weakest part of his interview was the body language. At times it was inconsistent with what he was saying, although to be fair, this occurred even in parts of the interview when he was telling verifiable truths. This leads me to conclude that this inconsistency was more to do with nervousness and, crucially, a shading of truths in order to stay within the lines of what he was authorized to reveal, versus what he might personally believe to be happening or have happened. In one sense, the messiness of his body language is a point in his favor since, if he were a disinformation agent, I'd expect him to be better trained to match his non-verbal with his verbal messaging. Overall, I think that Grusch is not psychiatrically unwell and believes what he is saying. That doesn't mean I believe him completely, though. I believe that he believes it, but he may believe it to be true only to have been fed disinformation by his sources for some unknown reason. So, before I can believe extraordinary claims, I'd need extraordinary evidence. So far, Grusch has only publicly made extraordinary claims and implied that others who aren't speaking publicly yet have the extraordinary evidence. I think that Grusch comes across as believable enough that his claims should be investigated by authorities with the clearances to get at the truth, whatever that is. He and others have not, however, provided sufficient evidence to prove the veracity of his claims at this point in time. So, where do we go from here? The US Congress and US Senate have the power to access the classified information which could provide the extraordinary evidence required to prove that Grusch's allegations reflect reality, as opposed to just something he believes or has been led to believe. Congressional and Senate investigations, both public and secret, appear to be the only way in which this can be settled beyond doubt. With that said, it is hard not to see Grusch as either or both a canary in the coal mine for other potential whistleblowers and a cat's paw for someone else. What do I mean by this? Well, I've worked in academia and dysfunctional organizations and seen and survived my share of infighting and backstabbing, albeit not about the presence of aliens. In these situations, it is common for one person to either volunteer or be voluntold to be the canary in the coal mine who checks if it is safe for others with similar information to surface. If the canary gets a bad reception, the other potential whistleblowers won't go public. If the canary gets a good reception and their allegations gain traction, then other potential whistleblowers go public. How could Grusch be a cat's paw? I'm sure that Grusch is an independent and capable man, but it is difficult not to see the guiding hand of someone like Chris Mellon behind this. It seems to me that Chris Mellon has been instrumental to the strategy underlying the increasing public awareness of UAPs since 2017, the reframing of the issue into a more politically palpable issue of threat, and the creation of the whistleblower reporting mechanism and protections which Grusch is testing. If this cat's paw hypothesis is correct, and there is sufficient media and public support in coming days and weeks, I expect that we'll see a series of additional coordinated public and private disclosures by other whistleblowers over coming weeks and months. The aim of these public disclosures would, logically, be to increase pressure on Congress and the Senate to investigate, while private disclosures would be aimed at directing Congress and the Senate in the right direction to uncover these unacknowledged special access programs. This sort of phased approach would also make sense in terms of creating a graduated exposure of the reality of the UAP phenomenon to the general public, who, let's be honest, have very little interest in it and don't care about the difference between Title 10 and Title 50 organizations and aren't versed in the details of UFO lore going back decades. I'd also like to deal with the import of some of the specific statements made. It seems to me that the statements about the involvement of the Vatican and Italian governments could be ways to create other avenues for advancing disclosure than just relying on the US Congress and US Senate. If the Vatican had documentary evidence of actions related to a crash in 1933, then even if Congress and the Senate got nowhere, perhaps progress could be made by a Vatican release of said evidence. Lastly, I think it is worth addressing the implication that US citizens have been killed to protect the program. I've seen some takes on the net that this is a priori illegal. However, I think if we bear the then Attorney General Eric Holder's letter of 2013 in mind, we can see that the US government holds that it is potentially legal to kill US citizens on US soil if it were to avoid a catastrophe. Here's the text of the letter. As members of this administration have previously indicated, the US government has not carried out drone strikes in the United States and has no intention of doing so. As a policy matter, moreover, we reject the use of military force, where well-established law enforcement authorities in this country provide the best means for incapacitating a terrorist threat. We have a long history of using the criminal justice system to incapacitate individuals located in our country who pose a threat to the United States and its interests abroad. Hundreds of individuals have been arrested and convicted of terrorism-related offences in our federal courts. The question you have posed is therefore entirely hypothetical, unlikely to occur, and one we hope no president will ever have to confront. It is possible, I suppose, to imagine an extraordinary circumstance in which it would be necessary and appropriate under the Constitution and applicable laws of the United States for the President to authorize the military to use lethal force within the territory of the United States. For example, the President could conceivably have no choice but to authorize the military to use such force if necessary to protect the homeland in circumstances like a catastrophic attack like the one suffered on December 7, 1941 and September 11, 2001. The letter concludes, were such an emergency to arise, I would examine the particular facts and circumstances before advising the President of the scope of his authority. Holder later clarified what he said somewhat in a second letter by writing, "It has come to my attention that you have now asked an additional question. Does the President have the authority to use a weaponized drone to kill an American not engaged in combat on American soil?" Holder wrote, "The answer to that question is no." This begs the question, but what if the citizen wasn't engaged in combat, but was considering doing something that a three-letter organization thought would be catastrophic? Could they then justify using something other than a drone? Possibly they might think these letters gave them enough leeway to argue they believed that what they did was lawful. Either way, this avenue is a powerful one for Congress and the Senate to pursue, as the extrajudicial killings of U.S. citizens on U.S. soil would surely galvanize public opinion and political will if it were proven. So, in conclusion, I think Grusch believes what he is saying, but there is always the possibility he was misled. What extraordinary evidence he has is almost certainly classified, and so what we, the public, will have to do is wait for more whistleblowers to come forward and congressional and Senate investigations to occur, or disclosure from another country or the Vatican. It seems likely that Grusch appearing publicly is part of a planned campaign of revelations about UAPs in coming months, and that more whistleblowers are waiting in the wings if his reception is positive. Only with the declassification of said extraordinary evidence, or a piling on of so many whistleblowers that we either conclude they are all being truthful, or a large portion of the US intelligence community has collectively become delusional, will the public ever get the extraordinary evidence we need. For now, though, I'm patiently looking forward to clarification about the Inspector General of Intelligence Services investigation, further clarification about supporting statements from other sources from journalists, investigators, and skeptics, particularly Coulthart, Blumenthal, Kean, Knapp, Corbell, Greenwald, and West. The appearance of further whistleblowers and whatever public investigations Congress and the Senate may hold. I intend to cover these developments which could provide the evidence needed to make better assessments of the veracity of the information provided by Grusch. Obviously, if Grusch or anyone involved is watching this, I'd also love the opportunity to interview him or them. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, as I intend to analyze UAP-related interviews and the topic in general going forward. I've included a list of references below, and also links to some books which may be of interest to anyone seeking to learn more about the UAP phenomenon. These are affiliate links, so if you use them, I may get a commission which I'll use to create more and better content. Let me know in the comments what other aspects of the topic you'd like to see covered. On your screen now, you'll see links which you can click to see other videos on the channel. Take care of yourselves and each other.